I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
The late autumn evening lay heavy over the village of Little Brampton, the kind of evening where mist clung low to the hedgerows and the lamps of the grander houses glowed faintly through the gathering fog. At the edge of the village stood the Grange, a house of old brick and ivy whose windows now shone with warm light. Inside, a gathering was underway, an evening dinner arranged by Lady Mortimer, widow of the late Sir Gerald, and a woman much respected, if not universally loved. At precisely 7 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. There was Colonel Arbuthnot, retired and opinionated; Miss Lydia Vane, a novelist whose tongue was as sharp as her pen; Dr. Charles Redfern, the village physician with a tendency towards secrecy; and Edmund Mortimer, Lady Mortimer's stepson, handsome, brooding, and never without some air of discontent. They were joined, somewhat reluctantly, by Mrs. Helen Whitcomb, the housekeeper whose long years of service had given her an authority few dared challenge. Dinner was lively, the fire in the great hearth crackling, but it was the undercurrent of tension that gave the evening its peculiar edge. The guests spoke of politics, of novels, of the upcoming hunt, but their eyes betrayed something unspoken. More than once, Lady Mortimer's gaze flicked toward her stepson, and more than once he caught it with cool defiance. It was not until the brandy had been poured in the drawing-room that Lady Mortimer, with a dramatic flourish, produced the object that would cast its shadow over them all. A letter. "My friends," she said, her voice steady but her hand faintly trembling. "This arrived this morning, addressed to me but unsigned. I hesitate even to show it, but I feel you should all know." The letter, scrawled in uneven ink upon cheap stationery, contained only one line: "Before the clock strikes midnight, there will be death at the Grange." There was a murmur, a sharp intake of breath, even laughter from Colonel Arbuthnot, who dismissed it as damned nonsense, the work of some mischief-maker. But others felt the chill in the words. Lydia Vane declared it positively Shakespearean, while Dr. Redfern frowned and muttered something about cruel practical jokes. Lady Mortimer folded the letter carefully, her expression composed, though her knuckles whitened around the paper. "I do not frighten easily," she said, "but one cannot entirely disregard such a warning." And so the hours passed with unease, as though each guest were privately calculating who might have sent such a letter, and who might, before midnight, lie dead. The clock in the hall ticked with dreadful insistence, its pendulum swinging like a harbinger. When the hour drew near, Lady Mortimer herself rose to retire, declaring the whole thing ridiculous, though her tone lacked conviction. At 11:15, she excused herself, her maid following dutifully up the staircase. It was just before midnight when the scream rang through the house. Guests leapt to their feet, brandy glasses clattering onto polished wood. Rushing upstairs, they found Lady Mortimer's bedroom door flung wide. There she lay, collapsed beside her writing desk, her lifeless hand still resting upon a second letter, its envelope torn, its contents half scorched in the dying flame of the fireplace. The clock struck 12, and in that precise instant, the affair at the Grange began. The scream still seemed to vibrate in the banister as Edmund Mortimer forced his way into his stepmother's room. Alice, the maid, stood rigid by the wardrobe, hands to her mouth. Mrs. Whitcomb, the housekeeper, steadied the gas flame. Colonel Arbuthnot dropped to one knee, but Dr. Charles Redfern shouldered past with practiced economy and bent over Lady Mortimer. She lay beside the writing desk, one arm outstretched toward the hearth. On the blotter, a torn envelope lay open. A curl of scorched paper smouldered in the grate. Her spectacles rested beside an ivory-handled letter opener pointing away from the desk. Redfern placed 2 fingers at her throat, then glanced at the corridor clock. "Midnight almost to the minute," he said. "She's gone." "Telephone the police," Lydia Vane said, her calm masking an avid attention. "Nor wander," Redfern added. The room must be preserved. Mrs. Whitcomb dispatched the footman. Then she closed Lady Mortimer's eyes. "Her ladyship disliked a spectacle," she murmured. Edmund hovered at the desk. "This will be the second letter," he said. "The first promised death before midnight. Now this. Brought to her room." He looked toward Alice. "When did you leave her?" 11:15, sir," Alice whispered. "I'd brought lavender water. She was writing and sent me to fetch hot milk at 11. When I returned, the door was locked. She said she was indisposed and to come back in the morning." Lydia went to the door. The key, old brass, sat upright inside the lock. The windows were fastened. The balcony beyond looked on the south lawn in fog. "A locked room," Colonel Arbuthnot announced. "Poison, I'll be bound." Redfern frowned. "Let us not manufacture conclusions." Each looked not so much at the body as at the little facts, the shifted bedside rug, the ash upon the blotter, the poker by the grate, though the fire was low. Mrs. Whitcomb kept her hands folded. Edmund kept his open, as if to prove their emptiness. Lydia's eyes counted and compared. The village constable arrived and telephoned the county. He sealed the door and posted himself outside. Downstairs, the drawing-room reclaimed them. The fire crackled, glasses stood where they had been abandoned, and the clock resumed its tick. "Her ladyship had a weak heart," Redfern said. "A fright could have done it." "And the letter?" Lydia asked. "To lay a trap in terror," Edmund said. "To kill by suggestion." "Stuff," the colonel muttered. "It gave a villain time. Who left the room between 11 and 12? "I went to the library," Lydia said. "I was in the study telephoning about a feverish child," Redfern said. "I walked the terrace," Edmund said. "I went to the butler's pantry," Mrs. Whitcomb said. "Billiard room," the colonel said. "Ask Benson." "Her ladyship would not willingly parade a scandal," Mrs. Whitcomb said, yet she read the first letter aloud. That was unlike her. "Unless she wanted witnesses," Lydia murmured, "or unless someone pressed her to do it." She watched Edmund's defiant stillness and Redfern's careful composure. Superintendent Hale arrived, spare and courteous. He heard the account, went upstairs with the constable, and returned with tidy gravity. "Until my men have examined the room and Dr. Redfern has made a formal report, I shall not pronounce on cause. No one leaves this house. Brief statements now, fuller ones in the morning," he added. He began with Edmund. There were disagreements regarding the estate. "There were discussions," Edmund said. "My stepmother valued order." "And you?" "I dislike injustice," he answered, and then, with a tired smile, "A poor alibi." Lydia gave an exact account and volunteered nothing she could not defend. To Redfern he said, "Who besides yourself knew her medicines?" "Mrs. Whitcomb and the maid," the doctor replied. "The housekeeper keeps the cabinet key. I attend the doses." Mrs. Whitcomb inclined her head. "The schedule has not altered in months." "The second letter," Hale said. "Was anything legible?" Edmund's jaw worked. A phrase only. A debt paid at last. The rest was ash. "Whose debt?" "If I knew," he said, "I might be either grateful or afraid." Hale straightened. "Keep to the public rooms. We shall search for materials matching the first letter. The second we must reconstruct." His gaze rested on Lydia, as though he recognized the one who had already begun to think. "One thing more," he added. "Did her ladyship tell any of you of threats before tonight?" "No," said Redfern. "No," said Edmund. "She would have told me," Mrs. Whitcomb said, and then softly, "unless she thought I could not bear it." The mantel clock reached the half-hour. The house made its ordinary noises. The faint clink in the kitchen, the wind at the panes, and in their ordinariness, something indecent. Lydia felt the shape of a problem settling. A warning kept like an appointment. A room closed against opportunity. A second message allowed to burn until the one line that mattered was gone. Somewhere in that trio lay the hand that wrote, and somewhere, she thought, lay the mind that wished to be admired for it. The night wore itself thin with whispers, footsteps along the corridors, and the persistent presence of Superintendent Hale and his constables. By dawn, the Grange stood under a peculiar silence, as though even the house was stunned at its mistress's departure. The guests, weary from the long night, assembled for breakfast under the strained hospitality of Mrs. Whitcomb, who presided over the coffee pot with tight lips and vigilant eyes. No one spoke freely. Each word was measured, tested before it was loosed into the room. It was in this atmosphere, brittle with suspicion, that Edmund Mortimer announced, "Gentlemen, we require an investigator who can do more than patrol doorways and collect handwriting samples. I have already sent a wire." At that, Hale raised a brow. "You interfere with the authority of the police, sir." Edmund met his gaze coolly. "I supplement it. My stepmother prized accuracy, Superintendent. I would do her the honor of it." Lydia Vane, who had been buttering her toast with deliberate care, leaned forward with sudden liveliness. "Do you mean," she asked, "Hercule Poirot?" Edmund inclined his head, and even Redfern allowed a flicker of interest to cross his face. Colonel Arbuthnot gave a grunt. "A foreigner with polished boots, I hear. If he is as clever as they say, perhaps he'll show us which of you wears a murderer's mask." No one laughed. By afternoon, a car crunched along the gravel drive, and the man himself stepped down. Neat, symmetrical, precise. His mustache an architectural marvel, his gloves spotless despite the dust of the road. Hercule Poirot entered the Grange, not like a man who had come to chase criminals, but like one who had come to restore order to a disarranged sitting room. His eyes, dark and luminous, took in each detail: the ivy on the walls, the footprint at the edge of the drive, the window curtains drawn against the autumnal chill. Inside, Hale greeted him with restrained courtesy. Poirot inclined his head, as though apologizing for intruding upon another's stage, then turned his attention to the company. "Mesdames, Messieurs," he said softly, "I am Hercule Poirot. You find yourselves in a house where death has entered at the very hour it was foretold. That is not coincidence. It is theatre, yes? But behind the theatre, there is always an actor." His gaze traveled from Lydia's keen interest to Edmund's rigid defiance, from the Colonel's restless shifting to Redfern's cultivated composure. "I would like," Poirot continued, "to speak with each of you in turn. For now, permit me the courtesy of the room where Lady Mortimer died." The superintendent led him upstairs. Poirot paused at the threshold of the locked room, noting at once the height of the windows, the pattern of the carpet, the distance between writing desk and hearth. He bent, not to touch, but to observe, the fine dust disturbed near the grate, the rug shifted by a fraction, the faintest smear on the letter-opener's ivory handle. "You have sealed everything, I trust?" he asked. Hale confirmed it. Poirot nodded, satisfied. "Très bien. Order must be respected. Later I shall consider who had the mind to disrupt it." Downstairs once more, he invited Edmund Mortimer to speak first. Edmund complied, standing erect, his hands behind his back like a soldier on parade. He recited his actions with brevity, but Poirot interrupted gently. "Pardon, monsieur, but precision, it is everything. At what minute did you go to the terrace? At what minute did you return? And when you returned, whom did you encounter?" Edmund frowned, recalculated, and adjusted his times by a quarter of an hour, without realizing he had betrayed uncertainty. Poirot made no comment, but filed the alteration away in the vault of his memory. With Lydia Vane, the interview was more conversational. She answered crisply, her novelist's eye supplying sharp observations about the others. Poirot listened with apparent admiration, but pressed when her account strayed into speculation. "It is the detail I require, mademoiselle, not the embroidery. Who spoke last before Lady Mortimer retired?" Where did she hold the letter in her hand? Ah, you do not recall, but you remember she placed it in her pocket. That is curious, is it not? Lydia faltered only slightly before recovering. Curious, yes, but perhaps she intended to answer it in private. Poirot's mustache twitched, as though amused by her deflection. The colonel blustered through his questioning, objecting to every insinuation. Poirot remained serenely polite, yet each interruption seemed to rebound, revealing the colonel's movements more clearly than his answers did. Redfern, by contrast, was unflappable. He gave his times, his medical opinion, and a cautious statement about Lady Mortimer's frail heart. Poirot fixed him with a look of quiet intensity. "You are a man of science, Dr. Redfern. Tell me, does the heart stop more readily when frightened by a letter or when encouraged by a draught placed in the evening milk?" The physician did not flinch, but his pause before replying was long enough to mark him in Poirot's ledger of impressions. At last, Poirot requested to speak with Mrs. Whitcomb. She stood with hands clasped, eyes downcast, but her voice did not tremble. She explained her duties, her presence in the pantry, her loyalty to Lady Mortimer. Poirot inclined his head gravely. "You have been long in this household. Such devotion is rare, and yet devotion, it can blind us, n'est-ce pas? We see what we wish, and not what is." She met his gaze for the first time, unflinching, and he regarded her with a shade of respect. When the interviews concluded, Poirot took a delicate stroll through the drawing-room, the hall, the library, touching nothing, yet missing nothing. At the mantel clock, he paused, noting the exactness of its chime and the regularity of its pendulum. "To strike at midnight," he murmured, "to keep such an appointment. Yes, it has the air of a play written for an audience. But who, I ask myself, wished most to be playwright?" As evening fell once more, Poirot rejoined Superintendent Hale. The household lingered in uncomfortable silence, aware that each of them had been measured and weighed by the little Belgian. Poirot stood by the fire, hands behind his back, eyes glittering. "We have, Superintendent, a letter before the death, a letter during the death, and a lady who lies silent between them. One cannot yet see the pattern, but the pattern, it exists. I tell you this, it is not a crime of passion, it is a crime of patience." And as he spoke, the faintest sound disturbed the room. Alice, the maid, timid and pale, had crept in to refill the decanters. But her face was blanched, her hand shook, and when Poirot asked what troubled her, she whispered, "It is only, sir, that I saw another letter, last week, in her ladyship's drawer. But I said nothing, for I thought it nonsense." Every head turned toward her, and in that instant, the atmosphere of the house shifted again, as though a hidden curtain had been drawn back to reveal that the first warning had not been the beginning, but part of something older, deeper, and infinitely more deliberate. Poirot regarded the trembling maid with a gentleness that belied the sharp glint of his eyes. "Ma petite," he said softly, "you will do us the kindness of explaining, in your own words, what you saw. Leave nothing aside, however small." Alice clutched the tray so tightly her knuckles whitened. "It was a week ago, sir. I had gone to air the bedchamber, and her ladyship had stepped out to the terrace. The drawer of her writing desk was left open, just an inch. I thought to close it, but then I saw a folded letter inside. On the top it said, 'You shall not escape the past.' That is all I remember. I should not have looked, I know. But I was frightened." The room absorbed her confession in silence. Lydia Vane leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "That alters matters entirely," she declared. "These letters were not written to amuse a mischievous spirit, but to haunt her ladyship with some hidden history, a past wrong." Colonel Arbuthnot snorted. "Nonsense, idle scribbling from a crank. I've seen such things, threats from creditors, angry servants. They mean nothing." Poirot raised a finger. "On the contrary, mon colonel, they mean everything. If one wishes to kill with certainty, one does not simply strike at random. One prepares the stage. Lady Mortimer was warned not once, but twice, perhaps more. Always there is the shadow of a debt unpaid, of a past unescaped. It is the psychology that interests me. A mind that writes such words does not wish only to kill, it wishes to torment, to instill dread. That is a vanity, a pleasure in cruelty. Superintendent Hale questioned Alice further, noting times and circumstances, but the girl could add nothing more. She was dismissed, leaving behind an echo of unease. Poirot turned back to the gathering. "We must consider, mes amis, who among you has reason to speak of debts, of past wrongs, of escape denied? I do not ask for answers now. I merely remind you that truth, it is like the oil upon water. Always it rises." That evening the household dispersed into uneasy occupations. Edmund walked the terrace again, his dark figure pacing the gravel with nervous energy. Lydia retired to the library, where the scratch of her pen soon reached the ears of those nearby. Whether she was taking notes for her own record or simply soothing herself with invention, none could be sure. Redfern consulted with Hale over Lady Mortimer's medicines, producing bottles and vials, explaining doses with clinical detachment. The colonel drank heavily and muttered to himself by the fire. Mrs. Whitcomb moved from room to room like a silent sentinel, ensuring that nothing strayed from order. Poirot observed it all, never seeming to impose, yet never absent. At supper he declined meat, preferring eggs and vegetables, and spoke little, but his eyes moved continually, catching a gesture here, a flicker there. After the plates were cleared, he asked Hale quietly if he might see the letters again. The first was produced intact, the second only in fragmentary ashes. Poirot spread the remains carefully upon a sheet of white paper, studying them as though each curl of burned edge might whisper a secret. "Regard," he murmured, "the ink that has blotted here. It was heavy, impatient. The writer pressed hard. That is not the hand of one at ease. That is the hand of one consumed." Later, in the drawing-room, Poirot placed himself before the assembled group. "There is an observation," he said, "that must be shared. Lady Mortimer, when she read the first letter aloud, did so in a manner most deliberate. She wished you all to hear. Why? Perhaps because she wished to show she was not afraid, or perhaps because she suspected that the author was present in this room and wished to observe the effect of their own handiwork. Ah, imagine the satisfaction, to see the others' faces, to measure their alarm, to taste the power. Tell me, who here felt their heart quicken when the words were read? No one spoke. Poirot's gaze lingered, not accusing, but piercing. He smiled faintly. "It is no matter. I shall learn it in due course." The clock chimed 9. Hale excused himself to confer with his men, leaving Poirot once more among the uneasy company. Lydia broke the silence. "Monsieur Poirot, you speak as though you already sense who wrote those letters." Poirot inclined his head. "I sense, mademoiselle, the type of mind. That is enough for now." He retired early, asking for a small lamp and paper. Alone in his chamber, he drew neat diagrams of the house, each guest's movements, each letter's appearance. He wrote a single phrase beneath: "Not coincidence, but design." He tapped the pen against his lip, then added another note. The second letter burned. Why preserve only the one phrase? He considered long, then extinguished the lamp. Downstairs, the rest of the household attempted uneasy sleep, but the night did not pass without incident. At 11:30, a cry startled the corridors once more. The constables rushed to the source, the library, where Lydia Vane stood trembling, pointing at her desk. Upon the blotter lay a fresh sheet of paper, its ink still glistening. In the same uneven hand, 3 words had been written: "The debt grows." When Poirot arrived, summoned by the commotion, he studied the page without touching it. "Bon," he said softly. "The actor has returned to the stage, but in his zeal, he makes the mistake all dramatists make. He cannot resist the encore. And an encore, mes amis, it is always dangerous, for it reveals the flaw in the performance." He looked around the circle of faces, startled, pale, defensive, and the faintest smile touched his lips. "We shall see very soon who among you cannot resist the applause of their own malice." The ink on the new note gleamed as if it had only just been laid down. Poirot bent low over the desk, hands behind his back, his shadow falling across the glistening words. "The debt grows," he murmured. "Curious, yes? Not merely the debt, but that it grows. That is the language of continuation, of insistence. The author is not satisfied with one death. He desires to remind us that the account is still open." Lydia Vane clasped her hands together, whether in excitement or dread, none could tell. "But how was it placed here? I was in the library not an hour ago. I stepped out only to fetch tea. The constables patrol the halls. The windows are locked." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Does this mean the murderer moves freely among us, bold as ever?" Poirot straightened, his eyes narrowing. "It means, mademoiselle, that the murderer has a gift for opportunity. You left the room. Others were nearby. The hand was quick, the ink fresh. Yes, someone here enjoys playing their little drama upon the stage they know so well." Superintendent Hale took possession of the note, instructing his men to search the desks of the household for ink bottles and pens. "We'll find the match," he said. But Poirot merely lifted a finger. Perhaps. But remember, Superintendent, ink is plentiful. It is not the pen that betrays. It is the psychology. The pen may write, but the mind chooses the words." The household dispersed reluctantly, each retreating to uneasy beds, though few slept. Edmund Mortimer paced the terrace again, shoulders tight. Redfern retired to his chamber, but was observed scribbling notes long after midnight. The colonel demanded another brandy and muttered of damned theatricals. Lydia remained wakeful in the library under the constable's watch, her eyes bright as if she were living inside one of her novels. Mrs. Whitcomb locked the pantries and cupboards, then moved quietly through the halls like a woman warding off chaos. Poirot, however, slept soundly, or so it seemed. At dawn, when the bells summoned them to breakfast, he appeared fresh, moustache immaculate, boots polished to mirror brightness. He took his seat at the table, folded his napkin precisely, and surveyed the company with mild amusement. "I've been thinking," he said, "about debts. Tell me, mes amis, what debt is it that grows? Money, yes, perhaps. But there are other debts also, debts of honor, of affection betrayed, of injustice not forgiven. Each of you must ask yourself, of what debt did Lady Mortimer stand accused?" His words hung in the heavy silence that followed. No one answered. Edmund's eyes darkened. Lydia's lips twitched as though she longed to speak. Redfern stirred his tea with unnecessary vigor. The colonel coughed, and Mrs. Whitcomb poured coffee with deliberate care. Poirot only smiled, as though each silence were more eloquent than speech. After breakfast, he requested to see Lady Mortimer's private papers. Mrs. Whitcomb, pale but composed, produced a tin box of correspondence. Poirot sat at the writing desk and began his examination. There were letters of society engagements, invitations, condolences. Nothing unusual. But among them, carefully tied with a faded ribbon, he discovered several older envelopes, the handwriting unmistakably that of Lady Mortimer herself. The contents were fragments of correspondence to her late husband, Sir Gerald. One in particular caught Poirot's attention. "Listen," he said quietly to Hale, who stood at his side. "You may do as you will with the estate, but you know as well as I that Edmund is entitled by right. I cannot shield him forever from your resentment." Poirot folded the letter carefully. "You see? Even in the past there was conflict, a debt of inheritance perhaps, a quarrel unresolved. This is the soil from which the threats may have sprung." By afternoon, Poirot assembled the household once more in the drawing-room. He stood before the fire, hands folded neatly, his eyes alive with quiet intensity. "We are in the presence of a murderer," he said, "but one who is not content with a single stroke. No, the hand that wrote these letters has a taste for performance. It is the theatre of crime that excites him. First the warning, then the act, then the encore. Always there is an audience. Always he demands that we watch. So I ask myself, who among you is most fond of watching, of observing others, of relishing the effect of their words or deeds?" He let the silence deepen. Lydia flushed but held her head high. Redfern gave a faint, humorless smile. The colonel scowled as though the question insulted him. Edmund's jaw clenched. Mrs. Whitcomb stared at the hearth as if the flames might devour her thoughts. Poirot raised his brows, satisfied with what he saw, but saying nothing more. Superintendent Hale pressed forward with more conventional measures, handwriting comparisons, ink tests, interrogations of staff. Yet Poirot remained detached, politely listening, occasionally making the smallest note in his little book. At last, as the clock chimed evening, Poirot turned to Hale with quiet finality. "The tests, they will tell you little, mon ami. A clever man or woman may disguise a hand. But the mind, the manner, that cannot be disguised. I have seen already the pattern. One thing remains before I may speak, the truth of the second letter, the one half burned. For in the ashes lies the key. Someone sought to destroy it, but also to preserve a phrase, a debt paid at last. Why preserve that, unless the phrase was useful to mislead?" As he spoke, a constable entered with news. The maid Alice had discovered something in Lady Mortimer's waste-paper basket, overlooked the previous day. Poirot received the crumpled scrap delicately. It was the fragment of a draft letter, written in Lady Mortimer's own hand, the ink unmistakable. "My dear friend," it read, "I cannot endure this persecution much longer. The letters continue. I fear they will drive me to my grave." Poirot's eyes gleamed as he folded the scrap. "Voilà. It is as I thought. The letters did not begin yesterday, nor last week. They were persistent, calculated, a campaign. Lady Mortimer knew her persecutor. She did not speak the name, but she knew." He turned back to the silent circle of faces, his tone soft yet deadly precise. "The debt, mes amis, is older than last night, and I promise you this, before long we shall learn whose account it was that Lady Mortimer was made to settle. With her life." Poirot allowed the silence to weigh upon the room, his delicate fingers resting upon the fragment of Lady Mortimer's draft letter as though it were a treasure of immense value. No one moved, and in the hush, the ticking of the mantel clock became strangely loud, each beat like a reminder that time itself pressed them toward revelation. At last, Poirot folded the scrap neatly and slipped it into his pocket-book. "You see, mes amis," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "this is not the work of an impulsive hand. It is the work of one who has cultivated menace over time, who delights in repetition, who nurtures the dread of his victim as one tends a garden." The superintendent cleared his throat, perhaps impatient with Poirot's abstractions. "We'll examine her papers more thoroughly," Hale said. "There must be other drafts, perhaps earlier letters." Poirot inclined his head in agreement, but his eyes lingered on the assembled faces, measuring every flicker of expression. Lydia Vane leaned forward in her chair, her pen clutched as if she were already writing the scene in her mind. Redfern sat rigid, his gaze fixed on the carpet, as though meditating upon some private calculation. Edmund paced the hearth with restless strides, the set of his jaw betraying an effort to control himself. The colonel fidgeted with his cufflinks, muttering occasionally about damned nonsense. Mrs. Whitcomb stood like a sentinel, her hands folded tightly, her eyes hooded with fatigue. Poirot shifted his attention to Edmund. "You have spoken often of injustice, monsieur," he said. "You believe yourself wronged by your stepmother's will, perhaps, by her authority in this house. Tell me, was it not you who stood most to gain from her death?" Edmund turned sharply, his face pale with anger. "That is precisely why I would not have done it. Do you think I am fool enough to strike when every finger would point to me? No, Poirot, I have enemies enough in this house without placing the rope around my own neck." His voice trembled slightly at the end, betraying more emotion than he had intended. Poirot bowed his head gently. "You are correct, monsieur, that the obvious is not always the truth. But remember, the cleverest deception sometimes is to appear the most obvious." Poirot next addressed Redfern. "Doctor, you told us Lady Mortimer's heart was weak. You prescribed her medicines, yes, sir, you knew the strength of her constitution better than anyone. Tell me, if one wished to end her life without leaving the mark of violence, would it not be possible to adjust a dosage, to alter a draught?" The doctor met his gaze steadily. "It would be possible," he said at last. "But I did not. My duty is to preserve life, not destroy it." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Even when that life stands between another and happiness, or fortune, or freedom?" Redfern's lips pressed thinly. "I have no such motives." Yet the pause before his answer lingered in the air like a shadow. Poirot allowed the question to drift away, his eyes now fixing on Lydia. "Mademoiselle, you are a novelist. You know the weight of words, the power of suggestion. You have an eye for human nature. Tell me, when Lady Mortimer read the first letter aloud, what did you observe? Not in the words, but in the faces." Lydia smiled faintly, as if relishing the chance to perform. "I saw fear in Alice, anger in the colonel, and something like satisfaction in Edmund. Dr. Redfern I could not read. His expression was too carefully controlled. As for Mrs. Whitcomb, hers was the strangest. Not fear, but sorrow, as though she had already accepted the letter's truth." Mrs. Whitcomb stiffened, but said nothing. Poirot's moustache twitched, très intéressant. "It is sometimes the sorrow that betrays knowledge. We grieve not for what is unexpected, but for what we feared would come." The colonel broke in impatiently. "All this talk of psychology, letters and debts and theatre. A woman with a weak heart dies, and you conjure phantoms. Mark my words, Poirot, it's some scoundrel from the village with a grudge, slipping in to frighten her. These locked room tricks, they are nonsense. No one in this house would stoop to such villainy." Poirot gave a small, indulgent smile. "Ah, mon colonel, you are brave and direct, but perhaps too much so. You believe murderers to be strangers in the night, masked and shadowed. But more often, they are those who sit beside us at dinner, those whose voices we hear daily. Murder, you see, is most often intimate." That evening, Poirot took a slow walk through the house. He studied the library again, lingering over the desk where the newest note had been placed. He inspected the inkstand, the blotter, the arrangement of books. He measured the distances in his mind, the time required for one to slip in and out unseen. He asked a constable where each guest had been at the hour the note appeared. Each alibi was fragile, resting on moments unobserved, corridors unguarded, a servant distracted. The play of opportunity was wide, and yet Poirot shook his head, unsatisfied. He retired to his chamber early, but he did not sleep. Instead, he sat in the lamplight, making neat notations in his book. He listed each suspect, each possible motive, each contradiction, and beneath them all he wrote a single phrase. "The debt that grows is not of money, but of conscience." At breakfast the next morning, the household gathered with eyes heavy from unrest. Poirot entered last, immaculate as ever, his manner brisk. He looked upon them all and said quietly, "We are close, mes amis. The letters are the key, but they are also the distraction. The truth lies not only in what was written, but in who delighted to see it read." He seated himself, unfolded his napkin, and began to butter his toast with the same meticulous precision with which he unraveled crimes. The others watched him in silence, each aware that the little Belgian already saw further into their secrets than they dared admit. And in that silence, the air of the Grange grew taut, as though the house itself waited for the next revelation, the next move in a deadly game whose author still walked freely among them. The silence that had settled over the Grange after Poirot's calm declaration at breakfast lingered long into the morning, as if the house itself had drawn in a breath and did not dare exhale. The guests moved through their routines with an air of nervous watchfulness, each step measured, each glance weighted with suspicion. Poirot, however, was the picture of serenity. He lingered in the drawing-room, examined a vase as though it might contain the sum of the mystery, straightened a cushion that had fallen askew, then turned with that feline stillness to observe the room's occupants. Nothing escaped his notice. Lydia's fingers tightening around her notebook when Edmund entered, the Colonel's restless shifting as though unable to endure the quiet, Redfern's habitual tapping of his spectacles against his palm when questioned, Mrs. Whitcomb's insistence on tidying objects that did not require tidying. Superintendent Hale returned from an inspection of the grounds, bringing news that the constables had found no signs of intrusion, no footprints in the soft earth, no broken latch, no tool marks on the doors. If the letters were placed by an outsider, Hale concluded, he has the stealth of a phantom. Poirot shook his head gently. Not a phantom, mon ami, a player upon the stage who knows every curtain, every entrance, every cue. Why search for shadows when the light is so full of actors? It was shortly after luncheon that a new development cast the household into deeper confusion. Alice, the maid whose trembling testimony had first introduced the idea of earlier letters, entered the library where Poirot sat reviewing his notes. She held in her hands a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "This came by post this morning, sir," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Addressed to Lady Mortimer, though she cannot receive it now." Poirot took the parcel delicately, examined the address. The hand was the same uneven scrawl as the earlier letters, though the strokes appeared heavier, as if written in haste or agitation. He untied the string, unfolded the paper. Inside was a small ledger, its leather cover worn, its pages filled with figures, receipts, and annotations in Sir Gerald Mortimer's hand. Poirot's brows rose. "Ah, a book of accounts, but see here, entries in another hand, later, uneven. Payments noted as owed, settled, renewed. And here, an entry circled twice, the Grange, debt unresolved." He closed the book with care. We see then that this is not the invention of a mad fancy. There was indeed a debt, financial or moral, linked to this house. Someone has chosen to revive it with vengeance. He summoned the household to the drawing-room once more, producing the ledger with theatrical simplicity. "Mesdames et messieurs, behold, the past speaks. It is in these pages that we glimpse the root of the letters. Sir Gerald, it seems, kept accounts not only of money, but of obligations. Some were never repaid. Who among you knows of this ledger?" The question fell into heavy silence. At last Edmund spoke, his voice low. "I've seen it once. Years ago. My stepfather used it to remind me of the allowance he doled out as if I were a beggar. He delighted in showing me the pages where my name stood beside figures I was said to owe him. I vowed never to look at it again." Lydia leaned forward, eyes glittering. "Then perhaps the debt was yours?" Edmund's face hardened. "Perhaps. But if I wished to escape such shame, would I flaunt it before the world with letters and threats? No. I would burn the book, not deliver it." Redfern reached for the ledger, leafing through with clinical detachment. These annotations in another hand. This is not Sir Gerald's writing. Someone continued his ledger after his death. Someone with access to his study. Poirot inclined his head gravely. Exactement, Doctor. And who, pray, had that access? All eyes turned instinctively to Mrs. Whitcomb. The housekeeper stiffened but did not falter. I managed the household accounts after Sir Gerald's death, she said firmly. Her ladyship entrusted me with the records, but I never made entries such as these. The hand is not mine. Poirot's moustache twitched as he studied her unwavering gaze. Perhaps, madame. But then, who else but a servant with keys and duties could move so freely through the rooms of the house? Mrs. Whitcomb did not waver. One does not serve a household for 30 years, only to betray it at the end. If there is a hand at work, it is not mine. The colonel gave a snort. All this talk of debts. What rot. A fellow with a grudge writes nasty notes, and now we are chasing ghosts in account books. But his bluster rang hollow. Poirot's eyes rested on him with a kind of amused pity. You dismiss it, mon colonel, yet your manner betrays discomfort. Have you too dealt with Sir Gerald's accounts? The colonel flushed and barked. I lost a little at cards with him, nothing more. Debts between gentlemen are always settled. Poirot's smile was thin. Are they, mon colonel? Always. The room quivered with the unspoken suggestion that each of them, in some way, was implicated. Hale broke the tension by ordering the ledger secured as evidence. Yet even as he gave the instruction, Poirot held up a hand. One moment, Superintendent. This book was sent by post today. Why now, unless the author of these threats wished us to see it? He grows impatient, more reckless. He believes himself untouchable. That is vanity, and vanity is the crack in every mask. As the evening drew near, Poirot withdrew once more to his chamber. He sat with the ledger open before him, tracing each entry with a fingertip, hearing in the figures the echo of quarrels, betrayals, promises unkept. At last, he closed the book, whispering to himself, the debt, it is not merely of coin, it is of pride, of resentment, of humiliation long endured. That, I think, is the root. When he rejoined the others in the drawing-room, his eyes were bright with certainty. Mes amis, he said softly, the murderer believes we are all blind, but already the net tightens. Very soon he will reveal himself, because he cannot resist the drama of his own performance. And when he does, we shall be ready. The words fell like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of unease through every face. Each knew Poirot had seen more than he allowed, and each felt, for the first time, that the end of this dreadful play was near, though whose downfall it would mark none yet dared imagine. The atmosphere within the Grange thickened as the hours passed, the ledger now locked away under Superintendent Hale's order, yet its shadow lingered over every conversation. Each guest carried the weight of those figures and annotations, as if the numbers themselves accused them. Poirot, calm as ever, moved through the rooms like a man, measuring dimensions for some unseen pattern. He asked no more questions aloud, yet his silence pressed more heavily than interrogation. It was in that silence that tempers began to fray. Late in the afternoon, Edmund confronted Lydia in the library. You seemed very eager to accuse me before Poirot, he said sharply, his face pale with suppressed anger. Lydia lifted her chin, her eyes glittering with defiance. I merely observed what was plain, that you, above all, resented Lady Mortimer. If you wish to silence me, Edmund, you had better find stronger arguments than a glower. Their voices rose until Mrs. Whitcomb intervened, her presence a sudden chill. This is not the time for quarrels, she said, her tone like iron. Her ladyship lies not yet buried, and you would dishonor her memory with shouting. The words silenced them, but the bitterness remained. Poirot, who had overheard from the doorway, entered with a measured step. You quarrel, yet you are united, he observed. United by your fear that the truth may find you. But take care, mes enfants. Quarrels reveal more than confessions. His words, softly spoken, left them both unsettled. As dusk fell, Hale suggested that the guests be confined more closely under guard, but Poirot shook his head. No, Superintendent. To confine them is to break the rhythm of the play. The actor must have freedom to act if he is to betray himself. Keep your constables alert, yes, but let the stage remain open. Hale muttered about foreign methods, yet complied. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. The long table, with Lady Mortimer's chair conspicuously empty, seemed like an accusation in itself. Redfern applied himself to carving the meat with unnecessary force. The colonel drank deeply, muttering of better days in the regiment. Lydia scribbled in her notebook even between bites, while Edmund pushed his food about without tasting it. Mrs. Whitcomb presided in silence, her face pale and set. Poirot, immaculate as ever, ate sparingly and spoke little, but his eyes never ceased their quiet watchfulness. It was during this uneasy meal that a new shock descended. A constable entered, pale and breathless, holding a folded sheet of paper. "Found this, sir," he said to Hale, "on the stair, as though dropped there, the ink still wet." Hale unfolded it, his brow darkening. He read aloud, "Another shall pay before the dawn." The room erupted in exclamations. Lydia dropped her pen. Edmund half rose from his chair. The colonel swore under his breath. Mrs. Whitcomb closed her eyes as though bracing herself. Poirot reached out a hand for the paper, studying it with fastidious care. "Again the same hand, again the same vanity," he said. "But mark this difference. Before it was midnight, now it is dawn. The author hastens the tempo. He cannot resist increasing the drama." "Then someone is in danger tonight," Hale said grimly. "We must double the guard." Poirot nodded, but his gaze lingered on the words. "Not merely danger, Superintendent. Certainty. He promises us another victim. He sets the stage for panic, for chaos. But it is a dangerous game, for if he acts again, he risks exposure." The household retired early under the watchful eyes of the constables. Doors were locked, windows checked, corridors patrolled. Yet unease gnawed at them all. Edmund paced his room like a caged animal. Lydia sat by her lamp, writing feverishly. Redfern remained in his study, examining papers with a doctor's meticulous eye, though his hand shook as he wrote notes. The colonel snored in his chamber, yet woke frequently with muttered oaths. Mrs. Whitcomb moved from room to room, ensuring the servants were settled, her face set like stone. Poirot, in contrast, prepared himself for bed with his usual ritual of precision, arranging his slippers side by side, setting his brushes in order, folding his clothes neatly. Yet once the lamp was extinguished, he did not sleep. He sat in his chair by the window, eyes fixed on the faint line of light beneath the door, listening to every sound in the corridor. Hours passed, the house alternately creaking and falling into silence. It was near 3 in the morning when a scream shattered the stillness. Constables rushed through the halls, doors opened, voices called. Poirot moved swiftly, his dressing gown immaculate, his eyes alive with grim expectation. The cry had come from the study. When they entered, they found Dr. Redfern slumped over his desk, his face deathly pale, a half-written note beneath his hand. On the blotter lay another slip of paper, the same uneven hand declaring, "The debt claims him." Lydia gasped. The colonel swore. Edmund pressed a hand to his mouth. Mrs. Whitcomb stood rigid, her lips moving silently as if in prayer. Hale bent over the body, feeling for a pulse, then shook his head. "He's gone." Poirot stepped forward, gently lifting the note beneath Redfern's hand. It was addressed to no one, merely a few words scrawled, "I can no longer endure." Poirot studied it, then shook his head. No. This is not suicide. It is too convenient. The letter, the position, the timing, all too well arranged. This is murder, again clothed in theatre. The hand that wrote the threats has struck once more, eager for his encore. The household stood frozen as the clock struck the half-hour. Poirot turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across them all. The murderer grows bold, mes amis, but also careless. Each performance reveals more of the actor behind the mask, and now I tell you this, the end approaches. The final act is at hand. Before the next dawn, the curtain will fall, and the truth will be revealed. The room seemed to close in upon itself after Poirot's pronouncement, the firelight flickering against the bookshelves of the study where Dr. Redfern's body lay. The constables carried the corpse away under Superintendent Hale's instruction, yet no one departed the scene without glancing back at the desk, as though fearing the dead man might rise again to accuse them. Poirot remained at the threshold until the others had withdrawn, then stepped inside with delicate precision. He examined the blotter, the overturned inkwell, the position of Redfern's chair, and the note written in the doctor's hand. He leaned so close, his moustache nearly brushed the paper. At last he murmured, "Yes, it is as I thought." The hand that lived was guided by another's will. The note is not a confession, it is a prop. When he emerged into the corridor, the household waited, pale and restless, their dressing gowns drawn tight against the draught. Edmund spoke first, his voice hoarse. "Does this mean we are none of us safe? That he will strike again?" Poirot regarded him quietly. "It means, monsieur, that the hand that plays at murder is intoxicated by its own cleverness. But intoxication is dangerous. It dulls caution, it breeds error. Already he has erred. He believes we tremble, but it is he who grows desperate." They gathered once more in the drawing-room. The colonel, red-faced with agitation, insisted Redfern had taken his own life. He was under suspicion, wasn't he? Poirot pressed him about the medicines, about his access. The poor fellow cracked and did himself in. Lydia shook her head sharply. "No, Colonel. That note was too conveniently left, too neatly timed with the threats. It is too pat, too theatrical." Her eyes glinted with something like admiration. "This is the murderer's encore, just as Poirot said." Mrs. Whitcomb, standing rigid near the hearth, spoke in a low voice. "Then we are trapped with a killer who strikes at will. Lady Mortimer, now Dr. Redfern." "Who next?" Poirot turned to her, his tone gentle but firm. "Courage, madame. The end is near. But to reach it, we must look backward. To the debt, always the debt. Lady Mortimer's death was not random. It was the fulfillment of an old account. Dr. Redfern's death was different. It was silencing, perhaps, or distraction. The pattern shifts, yet the hand is the same. Hale ordered the constables doubled through the night, though Poirot insisted they allow the guests to remain together rather than isolated. "Fear grows in solitude," he explained softly. "Together they watch one another, and the guilty hand grows restless." So the company remained in the drawing-room, dozing fitfully in chairs, the fire burning low, the clock ticking through the hours. Poirot himself sat upright, never closing his eyes, his small form taut with vigilance. Toward dawn, he rose abruptly. "The time has come," he announced, his voice breaking the fragile silence. "We shall end this play before it claims another actor." He instructed Hale to assemble everyone in the great hall, where Lady Mortimer's portrait loomed above the stair. One by one they came, Edmund pale and hollow-eyed, Lydia clutching her notebook, the colonel grim and muttering, Mrs. Whitcomb solemn as stone. Poirot stood at the centre, immaculate as ever, despite the long night. He surveyed them with piercing calm. "Mes amis, you have been patient while I have gathered the little details. Now we bring them together, and the truth," she steps forward. Lady Mortimer received letters long before the night of her death, letters that spoke of a debt unpaid. She feared them, yet she kept them secret. Why? Because she knew their author, not some stranger, not a phantom intruder, but one within her circle, one who delighted in her dread, who staged her death to strike at the very hour foretold. That is no accident, that is artistry. He gestured to the ledger Hale had locked away, now produced for the gathering. Here lies the heart of the matter. Sir Gerald Mortimer kept accounts not only of money but of wrongs. Some debts were never resolved. One among you discovered this ledger, saw in it a weapon, and turned it into a script for revenge. The letters, the phrases, the threats, these were not meant to frighten us. They were meant to frighten her, to remind her of what she had done, and to display the author's cleverness when the prophecy came true. The colonel burst out, "If you know who it is, man, then speak it plain." Poirot raised a hand for silence. "Patience, mon colonel. The psychology, she must be explained. Consider Dr. Redfern's death. He was not a victim chosen at random. He was the most dangerous to the murderer, for he knew the medicines, the frailties of Lady Mortimer's heart. He might have spoken too much. So the murderer silenced him, cloaked as suicide, with a note conveniently left. But the note betrayed its author. Redfern wrote carefully, with measured hand. Yet this scrawl, uneven and quick, was nothing like his usual script. It was a forgery, pressed into his dying hand to make the scene complete. A stir moved through the group. Lydia gasped softly, Edmund's fists clenched at his sides, Mrs. Whitcomb's lips thinned. Poirot's gaze lingered on each of them before settling with quiet intensity. And so we ask, who delights in words, who relishes performance, who sees life itself as a novel to be composed, a stage to be arranged? Mademoiselle Lydia Vane. The room froze. Lydia's face drained of color, yet her eyes burned with fierce light. "You accuse me," she cried. Poirot inclined his head. "Oui, mademoiselle, you who write tales of murder, who understand suspense and timing, who sat with your notebook ever ready even as the bodies fell. You who could not resist the drama of a prophecy fulfilled at midnight, the encore at dawn. The phrases, 'the debt grows,' 'the debt claims him,' they are theatrical, melodramatic. Not the language of a servant or a soldier or a physician, the language of an author." Lydia trembled, whether from fury or fear none could tell. "That is conjecture," she said. Poirot's voice sharpened. "Non, it is deduction. You had access to Lady Mortimer's papers, for you were often in the library, poring over her correspondence with the excuse of research. You discovered the ledger, you saw in it a plot. You envied Lady Mortimer's position, her authority, perhaps even her disdain for your novels, which she dismissed at dinner. You chose to make her life your story, to write her death as your chapter. And when suspicion might turn to you, you wrote a new chapter with Dr. Redfern as victim. But you erred, mademoiselle. You left traces of your vanity in every line. You wished to be admired for your cleverness, but that vanity unmasked you." The silence broke with Edmund's cry. "So it was you. You toyed with us, turned this house into your stage." Lydia's composure faltered. Her hands shook, her lips parted. Poirot stepped closer, his voice soft yet inexorable. "Confess, mademoiselle, the curtain has fallen. Your play is ended." Lydia's notebook slipped from her grasp, scattering pages across the floor. She gave a low, broken laugh. "Yes," she whispered. "I wrote it all. I wrote her dread, her death, his silence. I thought myself greater than the rest, the author of fate itself. But you—" her voice cracked. "You read my script too well." Superintendent Hale moved forward, placing a firm hand upon her shoulder. Poirot bowed his head slightly, his eyes unreadable. It is always so. The murderer thinks himself playwright, yet forgets. There is always a critic in the audience. As Lydia was led away, the others stood stunned beneath Lady Mortimer's portrait. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, smoothed his mustache, and turned toward the door. "Come, Superintendent," he said lightly. "Order has been restored. For Hercule Poirot, The play's over. The morning sun broke weakly through the mist, casting a pale light across the grounds of the Grange. The household, diminished and shaken, gathered one last time in the drawing-room, its heavy curtains drawn back to admit the reluctant daylight. Lydia Vane had been taken away under Hale's authority, her notebook sealed as evidence, her confession still echoing in the silence she left behind. Yet the others remained, each caught between relief and the grim knowledge of what had transpired within these walls. Edmund sat apart, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what he had witnessed. For all his defiance and anger, he looked younger now, almost boyish in his exhaustion. Mrs. Whitcomb moved quietly from chair to chair, ensuring each guest had tea poured, as though clinging to the rituals of service might mend the fabric of a house torn by betrayal. The colonel stared gloomily into the fire, nursing his bruised pride as much as his sorrow. Poirot stood by the window, gazing out at the fog lifting from the lawns. At last he turned, his small frame precise, his mustache immaculate, his eyes thoughtful, yet calm. "Mes amis," he said, "you have seen how vanity may destroy. Mademoiselle Vane, she wished not only to avenge a past slight, but to write herself into a drama, to be admired for her cunning. She thought to control every act, every line of dialogue. Yet she forgot the one truth. Crime, it is never as neat as the author intends. The psychology always betrays." Superintendent Hale, weary yet respectful, gave a nod. "Your method, Poirot, is unlike any I've seen. No fingerprints, no footprints. Just the mind, peeled back layer by layer. And it was the mind that revealed her guilt." Poirot inclined his head modestly. "It is always so, mon ami. The little grey cells, they are the only true detectives. One must listen, not only to what is said, but to how it is said. The words, the silences, the gestures. There lies the truth." Edmund rose, his voice unsteady. "I cannot pretend to mourn her, but I will not forget what this house has endured. My stepmother, though she was hard, did not deserve such cruelty. And Dr. Redfern, he was silenced for knowing too much. We are left with scars." Poirot approached him gently. "You, monsieur, must see this as a new beginning. Lady Mortimer's shadow no longer binds you. Do not let bitterness become your debt to the past. Repay it with honor, with order, with peace." Mrs. Whitcomb, her eyes glistening though her voice remained firm, whispered, "She trusted me with her household, and I failed to protect her." Poirot laid a hand over hers. "Non, madame. You were loyal, but no loyalty could shield her from the imagination of one determined to right her downfall. Do not reproach yourself. Your service was her comfort, though she may not have said so." The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, steady and deliberate, as though marking the restoration of order. Poirot glanced at it with satisfaction. So it ends as it began, with the clock. At midnight it told her death. At dawn it marked another. But now it speaks only of the ordinary passage of time, not of a prophecy fulfilled. That, mes amis, is as it should be. Order is restored. He moved to collect his hat and gloves, adjusting each with fastidious care. At the door he paused, turning back with a faint smile. "Remember, my friends, the lesson of the Grange. Murder is not merely an act of violence, it is an act of vanity, of pride, of conceit. And vanity, it will always betray itself in the end. One need only watch and listen and think." With that, Hercule Poirot stepped out into the pale morning, leaving behind a house that would forever bear the echo of fear, but also the memory of his calm, relentless reason. The others watched him depart in silence, each reflecting on their own role in the dreadful play that had unfolded. And though the future of the Grange remained uncertain, one truth lingered, clear as the rising sun. The little Belgian detective had once more restored order from chaos, leaving behind not only justice, but the sharp reminder that in every crime, as in every soul, the truth will rise like oil upon water.